It's now the man.
Now the monster. From my laboratory in the castle east to the master bedroom where the vampires feast.
So this is Amnesia Rebirth. It's a video game. Don't know if you've heard of those. I have. No big deal. This is a sequel to Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Well, I mean, and the other one. And Justine, I guess. But there was Amnesia: The Dark Descent, there was Justine, which was a DLC for that, and then there was Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs, which was set in the same universe, but wasn't really a sequel to Amnesia. However, despite Amnesia Rebirth being billed as a more direct sequel to Dark Descent, in terms of tone, atmosphere, and to be honest, most of the story, it feels much further away from The Dark Descent than A Machine for Pigs did. This feels like a very different game, even though many elements are indeed taken from the original game, and indeed there are many references to the original game. In this one, you still have Amnesia. Don't worry about that. It wouldn't be an Amnesia game if you didn't have Amnesia. I mean, it also wouldn't be 50% of RPGs if you didn't have Amnesia. But you've got Amnesia in this one, and this one's actually called Amnesia, so it's got a moral right. Rather than waking up in a spooky castle full of gothic horror, this one is set about a century later in 1937 Algeria. You are Tassie, who is sent with an exploration team. Your plane crashed, you wake up. Oh no, terrible crash, everyone's missing, can't remember what's happened. Better go out there, see what happened. That's the plot. It very quickly becomes clear that you have already been out of the plane, you've already gone on an adventure of sorts, and you are now going back through where you've already been to find out what happened to the rest of your team, and indeed yourself, because of the amnesia that you have in your head. Also, you're pregnant. This is something that could be considered a twist, I guess, but again, it happens really quickly into the game, and there's also a gameplay mechanic tied to it, so I've kind of got to talk about it. You can check on the baby at any time, you can look down at it, and if you feel it kick, you can look down, and your fear level will reduce, because of course your fear level will rise if you stay too long in the dark or start looking at scary monsters. The look at your belly to calm down mechanic is interesting from a presentation standpoint, although mechanically it is just looking at your tummy for a while. There is some more dialogue you can unlock by staring at your tummy at various points for a really long time, or like walking for a bit, looking down, getting another line of dialogue, walking a bit, and then looking down when she's stopped. It's a bit lengthy. I think, you know, if you're in a new area, just have a look at the tummy once and then get all the dialogue out that you want while I'm playing the rest of the game. The game itself is, in general, straightforward first-person horror fare. The kind of stuff that was a lot more new and exciting when Amnesia: The Dark Descent came out. But of course, The Dark Descent has had many pretenders, many follow-ups, many, you know, polishing up the formula, but not necessarily reinventing the wheel of this formula. The Dark Descent, many will say it's aged poorly, or it really shows its age. I recently replayed it in anticipation for Rebirth and actually finished it this time. And I think it's still pretty effective at what it does. I think its use of like building paranoia in the player, of getting them to balance up whether to hide in the dark from monsters or risk being seen in the light while they try and, you know, keep their sanity up. It's tried and tested and obviously very influential. I mean, this was one of the first big games that got all those YouTube reaction stuff back in the day. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I do think it's a much better horror game than Rebirth. Rebirth is a lot more polished. Things move a lot more fluidly. It's easier to do things like, you know, open doors and turn cranks and stuff. It's always a little bit finicky in The Dark Descent, and just things are tightened up here. but I don't think it's as effective a horror game. I don't think it's as interesting a horror game. I think it's got all of the tools to have been something very memorable and something very enthralling, but I don't think it does all it could do with what it has. One notable example is the main plot, the whole plot conceit of waking up on the plane with amnesia and then going back through and reliving, in essence, whatever happened to you and your crew out in the desert. This would have been so much more effective if the game gave you an opportunity to spend any actual real time with this crew to begin with. You get a very brief moment on the plane with the love interest character. Then you get very little else other than a here is this character before everything goes to hell. So as you then subsequently go through the game and start finding out what happened to all these characters or you know, meeting up with them or what have you, the emotional connection that Tassie has to these characters, I don't. So therefore uncovering what happened really didn't mean all that much to me, and it's a shame because there's some really good storytelling elements, especially when you meet one of the crew who now has an altogether more antagonistic approach to the player and offers one of the better hide-and-seek monster-go-boo segments in the game, but whose entire backstory and relationship with the player is only revealed after you've dealt with him more or less. And I feel like his whole encounter would have been so much more effective if we'd have gotten a hint of who he was before we see this version of him, so this version of him would have been even more monstrous and would have made more of a ghastly sense to us. And Rebirth is full of these moments where if it had just added a little bit more or presented things in a different order or just with a different pacing, it could have been so much more impactful on the player, certainly would have been more effective on me. The game does have some interesting moments and there's one really good chase sequence that follows a really nice claustrophobic area full of threats that feels like The Descent. The movie The Descent, not The Dark Descent, the movie The Descent, and in several good ways does it do that. The monsters, while not particularly scary, are better designed than the ones in The Dark Descent, because those were funny, and these ones are at least, you know, you could look at them and say that's a cool monster, not a frightening monster or a disturbing monster, but you know, this sort of twisted, elongated ghoul that chases you, or later on there's this sort of wispy, lantern-holding, bandagey ghost thing. There's a more variety of monsters for sure. Each main sort of chapter, each main area of the game sort of has its own threat. The voice acting is decent, the protagonist is voiced this time, and she has a lot to say about the situation, and she certainly adds a lot more of an emotional hook to the game that the overall plot structure doesn't. Removing tinderboxes and replacing them with matches is interesting. You do get a lantern that you can use to light up the dark areas, but you also get matches which you hold up and you can, you know, temporarily light your way. They'll burn out quicker if you move quicker, but there are candles and lamps and everything that you can use the matches to light if you get to them in time. So that's an interesting little mechanic. But overall, Amnesia Rebirth's biggest problem is it is now, despite the clout that its name carries, it is just another first-person horror game in a market absolutely stuffed with them, and it's really not memorable. It's not as memorable as the original. It's not as memorable as something like Outlast or Alien Isolation. It's not as good at building things like paranoia like the original did. You don't really feel under threat until you know there's a threat there, so you're not exactly paranoid. You just know when a monster is there, okay, this is the monster section. The puzzles are all really straightforward and simple. Pick up this thing, put that thing there, move a box. Really bargain basement stuff. None of it bad, just on the whole unremarkable. Amnesia Rebirth is the kind of game that would be a quality step up for something like the Layers of Fear series. As an Amnesia sequel, I think I went in just expecting a little more oomph. It's a fine enough game, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it's fine. And that is about it.
It's now the mash.
Now the Monster Mash.
The Monster Mash.
And it's a graveyard smash.
It's now the mash.
It's caught on in a flash.
It's now the mash.
It's now the Monster Mash. Now everything's cool. Drax a part of the band in my Monster Mash.